What we're going to do is, as people come in, we're going to try to fill in the empty seats. So hopefully everybody can fit in this room, and we won't need another room. But it is being webcast, and people who arrive really late will be shunted off to another room. For those of you who don't know, my name is Blair Rubel. I'm director of the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And the Wilson Center is the official presidential memorial to the only American president to have a PhD. Hence, it's an international center for scholars. And we're here to talk about events that happened 15 years ago. And 15 years is a kind of awkward moment because not everyone, but probably most people in the room remember 15 years ago. It still seems fresh, and yet we know that memory sometimes can play games after 15 years, and information that wasn't available at the time is available now. So it's an awkward moment because people's perceptions have changed, and yet their memories are very strong. So we thought we would try to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 by inviting here some Americans who were in a way involved. They were professional observers inside the government and without of the events that were unfolding, and to ask them to reflect back on how they viewed the events then and how they view the events now. This is an American perspective. There are no Russians here, but we think that that is valid as well because we are in yet another period in which discussions about policies towards countries like Russia and Ukraine and the countries of Central Asia are beginning to take off again, and we thought it would be useful to hear what people who dealt with some of the issues raised by the collapse of the Soviet Union felt at the time. I'm not going to give a full introduction to the speakers because time is short and each one of their biographies is far too long. There are sheets that are available. As you'll see, they're all quite distinguished. I will, in a moment, quickly identify everyone. But I have to say the one discovery I made in looking over the biographies is that despite the fact that they are associated with such august power institutions as the State Department, in fact, they're all from the South and the Midwest. So I think that says something about the American system that we shouldn't forget. So let me just identify the speakers in the order in which they're going to speak, and then we'll get right to the remarks. Each speaker's been instructed to take no more than 15 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. We'll hear from Ambassador Jack Matlock, who is presently the Saul Linowitz Professor of International Relations at Hamilton College. He's a former U.S. ambassador to the USSR between 1987 and 1991, and he's also a former member of the Kennan Institute Advisory Council. Wayne Merry is Senior Associate with the American Foreign Policy Council here in Washington. And between 1991 and 1994, he was Chief Domestic Political Analyst with the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Ambassador Richard Miles is Executive Director of the Open World Leadership Center here in Washington. He happens to be Chair of the Kennan Institute Advisory Council, and he's former U.S. Ambassador to Georgia, Bulgaria, and Azerbaijan. And between 1988 and 1992, he was U.S. Consul General in Leningrad. Ambassador James Collins is presently Senior International Advisor at Akin, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and former Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow between 1990 and 93, and U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation between 1997 and 2001. And Professor Stephen Cohen is Professor of Russian Studies and History at New York University. So, Jack, the floor is yours.
Well, Blair, thank you very much for the invitation to come and be here with so many colleagues, friends. And I must say that I know that there are people in the audience who went through these periods with us, not only on the American side, but also on the Soviet side. And I hope we'll be hearing from them in the discussion. I thought I might start out by addressing what I consider some of the most damaging and mistaken myths about the breakup of the Soviet Union, because I think that these are very widespread. I hope they're not widespread among those of us who really experience these events, but they are among the public at large. And I would like to at least set them to rest, at least in terms of the way I understand things and understood them at the time. Now, the first of all, I would say that I was really quite outraged at the multi-part TV series on the end of the Cold War. It was shown on CNN a few years ago, but it ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that's absolutely incorrect. The Cold War ended well before the Soviet Union collapsed. And one really, I believe, has to look at the three seismic events, seismic in geopolitical terms, that occurred right at the end of the 80s and culminated in 91. Now, these three events are interconnected, but they were different events, they had different causes, and the American role was quite different. The first of these, I would say, was the end of the Cold War. And we can argue about when that ended. I think it ended ideologically in December 88, but obviously there was a lot of cleanup diplomacy. I've been accused of belittling it by calling it that. I don't belittle it at all. It's extremely important diplomacy. But certainly by the, I would say, early autumn of 1990, the Cold War was totally over, including most and all of the important things that had happened in the Cold War and had raised the tensions. By then, of course, Europe had been united. Germany was united, allowed to stay in NATO with Soviet blessing. The immigration was virtually free at that time from the Soviet Union. That had been a big issue from us. The reforms were beginning to be almost dizzying in their rapidity. But when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Soviet Union voted with the United States and others in the Security Council. Now, there was not one element of the Cold War left at that point. And now, what the first of these seismic events was, in fact, the end of the Cold War. And that's one that I think the United States and the Soviet leadership of that time cooperated. One of the myths that we hear, and I think it's very damaging, is we won the Cold War as if that was a victory over another country. I think President Reagan in his memoirs put it much more accurately when he said it was a victory of one system over another. And I would add to that, because that system was changing and changing very rapidly. And Gorbachev, I think, made no concessions that were against the interests of his country, far from it. The agreements we made were in the interests of both countries. It was a win-win situation. And it freed the Soviet Union of the burden of the arms race, which was really killing it. So the end of the Cold War, yes, and there was cooperation, and both sides won. It was the communist system and the old policies that lost, but they were changing already. The second big change, and this didn't occur overnight, but it occurred very rapidly, was the end of communist control over the Soviet Union, ultimate communist control. Now, this was not done by Western pressure. I'm a great admirer, as people know who have read my books, of President Reagan and his diplomacy, but he was not the man who defeated communism. The man who defeated communism in the Soviet Union was Mikhail Gorbachev. And he did it as General Secretary, and he was probably the only person who could have done it, by step, virtually forcing the party and inducing the nomenclatura to vote for that at times, to take itself out of total control of the country. It was really these two events that eventually made the breakup of the Soviet Union possible. And it broke up, I think, entirely because of internal pressures, internal contradictions, and it would not have happened, in my opinion, if the Cold War was still on. The Cold War had been, and those pressures were like a pressure cooker. The pressure's on it. It was holding the steam in. As long as those were there, this helped keep the Soviet Union intact. It helped keep the Communist Party control. When they dropped at the end, when the Cold War ended, this created an entirely new situation. So it seems to me that I feel very strongly on these points, and that the misunderstanding of them, and particularly the triumphalism later in the 90s, treating Russia as if Russia was a defeated country, when Russia wasn't even a party to the Cold War. It was only one part, though the largest part, of the Soviet Union. Now, related to that is the myth that somehow the U.S. forced the end of the Cold War by its military pressures. Now, our military buildup was designed not to end communism. In fact, I recall fairly early on in the Reagan administration, when I was summarizing instructions for people, after putting our position down, I had an addition saying, we will not question the legitimacy of the Soviet government. We did not ask for regime change. We asked for a change of behavior, particularly a change of behavior externally. And so I think our military buildup was meant to back up our diplomacy, not to give Gorbachev an easy way out, knowing that he really needed to reduce the defense burden, but to encourage him to open up the country and reform simultaneously. And this, I believe, was in the ultimate interest of the Soviet Union, if it could have been kept together at all. So I think the idea that we did it entirely with force and the Soviet collapse was dictated by that, again, is quite wrong. And frankly, that perception, which many people had, I think, has led us to some very serious foreign policy mistakes since then. A third one I will mention, and is that the U.S. was caught unawares. It's as it's usually say, well, the CIA never predicted the breakup of the Soviet Union. Well, that's true. Thank goodness the CIA never officially predicted the breakup, because the moment they did, if they had, it would have leaked, and the whole process of reform would have ended. That doesn't mean our policymakers didn't understand what was going on. I sent my first message, which advised the United States government to make contingency plans for the possible breakup of the Soviet Union in June 1990, 18 months before it happened. And this was not based upon clandestine intelligence. During my term as ambassador, and that was from 1987 to August 91, we did not have a single spy recruited in the Soviet Union, because our moles here, Hansen in the FBI and Ames in the CIA, had betrayed them all. We simply were there. We had a terrific staff. Jim Collins led it and managed it beautifully. They were all over the place. Ents Silins out of Leningrad was going to the Baltic states and Latvia, and so on. We had people who spoke Uzbek. We had people who spoke Ukrainian. And once the country began to open up, frankly, we were all over. And without any false modesty, I'll say I think our embassy understood much better what was happening in the country than Gorbachev did himself, because the KGB was giving him false information.
Absolutely.
There's another lesson here that some people seem to have forgotten, is, when you insist upon hearing only what you want to hear, you usually don't get the true picture. So, yes, we saw what was happening. We did not want it to happen that way. Of course, we wanted the three Baltic countries to get their independence. We would have been very happy to see Gorbachev negotiate a voluntary union treaty with 12 republics. And as a matter of fact, when President Bush the Elder, August 1st, 1991, in Kiev, made a speech that Bill Safire jokingly called the Chicken Kiev speech. If you go back and look at what he said, and that was supposed to be a speech for all the non-Russian republics, not just Ukraine, but what he said was, don't confuse freedom with independence. Freedom first. Because if you go for freedom, then, okay, if you eventually find you need it, you're probably going to be able to get it. And he did speak of suicidal nationalism. He wasn't speaking of Ukraine at that time. But the fact is that we did not engineer, we did not press. Obviously, we had no influence over the situation at that point because, as I said, the internal forces, aided by some of Gorbachev's mistakes, were really was what was throwing the country apart. Finally, there are many of these I could talk about. My time is virtually up. I would just add one thing, and that is many people really cheered when the Soviet Union collapsed, thinking, this is the end of problems, that suddenly it's all going to be sweetness and light, and so on. When I wrote a book on the collapse of the Soviet Union, Autopsy on an Empire, it was published in '95, I said, my champagne is still corked because we don't know what's going to happen yet. The problem was that in Gorbachev's last years, it was Moscow that was giving great support to the democratic movements in many of the other republics. I had Belarusians tell me that, our local officials would not let me publish my things. I'll go to the Central Committee in Moscow and they'll order them to let them be published. I talked in '91 to democratic forces in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. Now, almost all of these forces have been virtually wiped out, and they were very quickly. So, to many parts, you could say the breakup occurred at a time, and often, I think, because the regional party, the Republic Party leaders, saw the reforms, saw that they were going to undermine their power, and chose independence as in order to maintain their power. So, as we look back, I think that I think it is important for us, as we remember those days, to think about what really happened and what lessons we should be drawing from it, and perhaps some that we have forgotten. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Wayne?
Thank you, Blair. And let me say it's a privilege to appear on so distinguished a panel. For me, the breakup of the Soviet Union and its attendant empire I see as one of the three great transformative geopolitical tendencies in my lifetime, the other two being the decolonialization of the former European imperial empires, to which the breakup of the Soviet Union contributed, and the return to global prominence of Asia, and particularly China, to which the breakup of the Soviet Union also contributed. These three great transformations had deep roots, big, long histories, and the consequences will be with us for the rest of our lives and well beyond. But the breakup of the Soviet Union was unique in at least two respects from my personal experience. I mean, the first was just as geopolitical drama. Even to be a bit player mostly in the wings during that period was an experience unique and almost worth entering the Foreign Service just to be able to do that one thing. Because of the concentration in time and space of those events, I think it presented to the world events worthy of consideration and historical debate of a kind that we haven't seen since the end of the Second World War. And the second thing, why it was so important, was its impact on the interests and the policies of the United States. because since the end of the Second World War, the United States had largely defined its role in the world in contradistinction to the Soviet Union and its power system. Almost all of our policies around the world were, in whole or in part, defined by that rivalry. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union, we've been going through a 15-year-long process of trying to figure out what we want to do in the world and to define what our role should be. Some people are looking for a new enemy, whether radical Islam or China or something else. And I think really much of the debate between the neoconservatives and so-called realists is a debate about what the United States should be in a world in which the fundamental definition of our role is not anymore about them, but is about us. And I don't think this process is anywhere near an end. Another thing the breakup of the Soviet Union did was to totally transform the relationship of the United States with what had been the principal stage, not the only stage, but the principal stage of that rivalry, which was Europe. And this had largely defined my entire professional career. The divided city of Berlin, divided Germany, divided Europe, NATO, Warsaw Pact, everything that had gone on the East-West relationship across the Iron Curtain. And the extent to which American policy and American interests had been engaged in that and then no longer were. So the transatlantic relationship, I think 15 years on, is still very much the beginning of a transformation in which most people in policy-making positions, I think in capitals on both sides of the Atlantic, haven't quite yet accepted the fact that which joined us together then is no longer joining us together now or in the future. Now, unlike the other panelists, I had the advantage of being up on this stage a year ago for a solid hour talking about what it was like to be in Moscow in the political section during the breakup of the Soviet Union, so I'm not going to repeat myself on that. I want to draw attention to what I think were two important aspects of it. One was that I think everyone, observer and participant, Russians and foreigners, all very much in Moscow did have a sense of the importance of what was going on, of being involved in a tectonic historical transformation. This was not like being through a normal crisis. In the Foreign Service, you go through crises aplenty. This was something very different in which every week, every day, sometimes almost every hour, brought about events which you never expected to see in your lifetime. The pressure on us in the embassy was colossal. The pressure on the Russian participants, much more so. And I'm sometimes been asked by scholars as to why certain things weren't done, why Yeltsin didn't do this and that. And my usual response is to say that it's because there are only 24 hours in the day. And everybody was at saturation point. Now, we obviously judge the impact of these events in terms of its importance for the outside world, for our own country. The Russians, of course, viewed them differently in terms of the role and impact for their own country. And I think this did tend to skew our perspectives a good deal. But I think something which is not recognized is how much time and attention was consumed by those things which, in fact, did not happen, by events which did not transpire, but which might have. And the degree of concern that there was in our government, in the Russian side, for the so-called nightmare scenarios, so-called loose nukes, warlordism, true disintegration of the Russian Federation, collapse of the social system, large-scale migrations. Now, we know that these things did not happen. But the fact that they did not happen doesn't mean that they didn't consume an enormous amount of time and energy so that they didn't happen. And the notion that they could not have happened, I do not accept. Because if you look at former Yugoslavia, parts of the Caucasus and Tajikistan, there were some pretty nasty nightmares that did come into existence. I think they didn't happen in the Russian case for two reasons. One, because so much of the end of the Soviet Union in Russia was a top-down Moscow-centric event that did not, unlike East Germany or Poland or the Baltic states, some other cases, involve societal-wide transformations. And the other reason is because the institutions tended to behave extremely responsibly. People went to work even when they weren't being paid. People went to work when they had no idea what their future was going to be. And I think unrecorded and unacknowledged as the extraordinary responsible behavior of what we call the power ministries, the KGB, the other security services, and the military, who accepted an extraordinary loss in global status. They went in a couple of years from having their western perimeter beyond the Elbe back to borders which Russia had had about the time of the beginning of the Romanov dynasty. And yet look what the things which did not happen. There was no Russian Stahlhelm. There was no Bonapartism, even though there were a few candidates for that role. And most extraordinary to me, there was no Russian equivalent of the OAS. There was no extra-legal action by people from these enormous structures of power. And I, to some degree, attribute that to one of the positive legacies of the Leninist state, which was its resolute subordination of instruments of state power to civilian political authority. And I think that if that had also been a legacy of the Titoist system, the tragedy of the Western Balkans would have been much less. Now, 15 years on, I must say that I am pretty pessimistic and negative in my views about how things are likely to develop in Russia, but not principally because of the current affairs that so focuses the attention of headline writers and editorial writers, but mostly because of my appreciation of how massive is the inherited burden of the 7 decades of Soviet misrule, and how extraordinary are the challenges that this society faces, most particularly in demographics and health, which go way back. I mean, those numbers were going in the wrong direction as far back as the 1960s, but also in areas like agriculture, misinvestment in industry, and in particular the legacies of power structures which are vertical in a modern world in which most innovation and creativity take place in what are normally thought of as horizontal relationships, and through the continued vitiation of what's normally called civil society, that part of society which exists between the state and the family, and where also most innovation, creativity, and responses to societal challenges take place. So the inheritance of a system which is so statist and so vertical, I think makes Russia remarkably unprepared to deal with these multiple crises, these legacies of the Soviet period. But you know, if you look at 15 years of post-war Germany or France, you might want to take a somewhat more optimistic view. 15 years on, post-war Germany had experienced a good deal of economic recovery, but was still deep in the great historic amnesia, as the society had not even begun to deal with the legacy of its Nazi past. 15 years on, post-war France was in the transition from the Fourth to the Fifth Republic, is damn near in civil war. I mean, there were tanks in the streets of Paris, and the OAS literally was trying to take their country into civil war. And what I think of when I look at the experience of those two countries in the period, say, between the 15-year mark and the 50-year mark, is how much domestic turmoil, including genuine political violence, those years required to get those two countries to be the kind of successful, stable, moderately boring societies that they are today. I don't know where Russia's going to be at the 50-year mark, but I think it would be unreasonable not to expect that the years between the 15-year post-Soviet mark and the 50-year mark will not experience a great deal of internal turmoil and probably a good deal of political violence. And I don't think anyone should be surprised by that, and especially we shouldn't be condescending about that. If it could happen in France and Germany, it can happen in Russia as well. At the 15-year mark, I don't think it's too soon, however, to give something of a report card on U.S. policy during this period. I would give the U.S. government an A- in 1991. I never give an A+ because my principal professor in graduate school never did. I'll give a B+ in 1992 and then a declining grade thereafter. I think the general crisis management of the U.S. government during the period 1989, 1992, for the most part, was excellent. I think there were some serious failures of omission rather than of commission, and I think these were the institutional lack of responsiveness of the international financial institutions and parts of the U.S. government to challenges that they didn't recognize and understand, and the tendency of responding with sort of very off-the-shelf USAID programs and with macroeconomic stabilization programs, which missed what was really necessary. And the disinclination of these institutions to give serious, let alone positive consideration to creative solutions. I think back, just as an example, on George Soros's proposal to fund a supplement to the salaries of social workers like teachers and nurses and such during the period of the high inflation in 1992. A very creative idea, which I think could have made a real difference, and which unfortunately got nowhere. I think it's sort of characteristic that in many ways the most imaginative U.S. government response to these events came from Capitol Hill in the form of the Nunn-Lugar program, and that what you needed was that kind of individual initiative because the bureaucracies were so experienced at dealing with undeveloped countries that they really had little inclination to do the kind of serious examination of what was required in a situation of post-Soviet Russia. And finally, just sort of as a coda to my remarks, I'm going to repeat one point that I made a year ago. It's a somewhat pedantic one. But it's the issue of when the Soviet Union, in fact, ended. Now, the sort of popular view is associated when Mikhail Gorbachev signed his letter of abdication. To me, that's confusing the ship of state with the figurehead of the ship. I think in a de facto sense, the Soviet Union had long been out of existence, somewhere between the August Putsch and certainly no later than the Ukrainian independence referendum. But as a de jure, juridical point, I choose another date that we passed the anniversary of earlier this week. And that is that in the aftermath of the signing of the agreement which created the Commonwealth of Independent States by Yeltsin, Shushkevich, and Kravchuk, Yeltsin returned to Moscow and had the Russian Federation unilaterally abrogate the 1922 Treaty of Union, which created the Soviet Union. And then the Russian Federation Congress of People's Deputies, somewhat reluctantly, as I recall, ratified that act. I choose that as the end of the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union did have a technical starting point. It was the Treaty of Union adopted at the end of 1922. But that treaty created an asymmetric structure in which the Russian Federation really was the keystone. And other Union republics could come and go and be reformulated and renamed as they were over the decades without affecting the constitutional integrity of the whole. But that once the Russian Federation itself left the Union, I believe the Union became a juridical as well as a practical nullity. Now, what was remarkable is that at the time, the only people who took this action terribly seriously were those members of the Russian Congress of People's Deputies who were opposed to it. And I recall in particular that the U.S. Embassy reporting on it, which I wrote, was brief and focused exclusively on the importance of this event for Russia, not for the Soviet Union. And I think in some ways, if my analysis of when the Soviet Union legally came to an end is a correct one, it's characteristic that such a momentous event passed into the flotsam of history almost without any notice.
Thank you. Dick Miles?
Thank you very much. I want to make one little correction on bio remarks that were made earlier. I don't usually do it, but it's important in this case. I left Leningrad in summer of 1991. I was not there during the putsch.
Can you move the microphone a little bit closer?
I was not there during the putsch and the subsequent events. Others in the audience were there. And while I may speak, I might say a few words about those events in August of 1991. If others want to correct me, fine, because I wasn't there. What I know about that period came from reading about it and talking to others. But I was there from 1988 until 1991, and it was certainly an extremely exciting time. I'll just remind, most people in the audience know this, but I'll just remind you that because of U.S. policy of not recognizing the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union, the American ambassadors had not been allowed to visit the Baltic states. And so the consuls general in Leningrad, after the establishment of the consulate general in 71 or 72, did go, except they would just make polite protocol visits in and out very quickly to not give undue recognition to those communist governments there. Usually they'd go once a year. Well, when I arrived in 1988, things already were quite changing, I would say. And 1989, 1990, 1991, of course, they changed quite dramatically. So that in the last year and a half, let's say, from '89 until until late '89 until summer of 1991, I was asked by the embassy and by the people in Washington, National Security Council was quite interested in all this, to keep a near continuous presence in the Baltic states, which was not always easy to do because we had a relatively small embassy, but we wanted desperately to keep people like Wayne tucked away in Moscow and not come and encroach on our turf, and so we did the best we could. I'm a former Marine, and in the Marines, you know, every person is a rifleman, no matter if they're a professional cook or whatever, and so every American in the Consulate General became a professional diplomat, and we had GSO people and administrative people and consular people going over and writing, you know, quite interesting reports actually, because they brought a little different viewpoint to things. We had pretty intensive contact with the reformers, would-be reformers in Leningrad, and with the nationalist leaders in the Baltic states. I must say, I felt all the time I was there that I was just turning pages of history right in front of my eyes. There were some there were some villains around, of course, but there were also some real heroes and heroines in both the northwest Russia and also in Leningrad and also in the Baltic states. People who had suffered for their beliefs and now felt the times had changed and they were not going to be put down. In many cases, this reform movement grew out of ecological movements, environmental movements in both Leningrad and in Estonia. Certainly that was true. But they quickly became politically oriented. And in Leningrad, they became really quite active and more active than I realized. I think we tried to report accurately what was happening, but we underestimated them, and frankly, I guess we underestimated the times. I remember in the election for the Supreme Soviet deputies, when, and I'll tell you the punchline first, the first secretary of the Communist Party was denied his seat. The commander of the Leningrad military district was denied his seat. I don't know how many other people fell, in a sense. And I was called that evening of election day by a correspondent in Moscow, an American correspondent, and was told that informal election polls of people coming out from having voted showed that these Communist Party apparatchiks and so on had not retained their seats. And, you know, with good diplomatic chutzpah, I said, really, I find that pretty hard to believe. And even if the voters turned out that way, the authorities would probably not allow it to happen. So I urge you to discount those election polls. And I did have the grace to call back the next day and say, well, if you want to hear a diplomat eat humble pie, I'm prepared to eat it, because that is exactly what happened. And that was followed, of course, by the Democrats taking control of the Leningrad City Soviet. That was not all as smooth as people like to think in retrospect, and there's some good articles about that, which will go into much more detail about it. But and in fact, they could not agree. Once they took control of the City Soviet, they couldn't agree among themselves on who would become chairman, that is to say, mayor. And everyone liked Mr. Sobchak, who was, in fact, a deputy of the Supreme Soviet, but he was, unfortunately for everyone, not a member of the Leningrad City Soviet, and therefore could not become chairman of it. However, there was a handy by-election that was coming up where insufficient votes had been cast the first time around, and they urged him to run for that, and they urged everyone else to stand down, and he indeed was elected, and then was elected chairman and became rather famous mayor, and even more famously appointed Mr. Putin as his economic advisor and later as his deputy mayor. Putin's appointment as deputy mayor came after I left, and so I don't know how he functioned in that capacity, but I knew him reasonably well when he was the economic advisor to the mayor, and I found him reasonably straightforward and pragmatic individual whose yes meant yes and whose no meant no, and his maybe actually meant maybe rather than forget about it. So we had a pretty good relationship. He came to the residence there of the Consulate General, never with his wife, not a very sociable fellow, but he would come to these receptions and working lunches and dinners and so on. have a drink, answer people's questions. He wouldn't engage much in conversation. He was a good observer, and that was my experience pretty much with Mr. Putin. I don't know what role he played during the days of the putsch in Leningrad. As I said, I wasn't there. I've read some things about it which suggested that he played a strong role on behalf of the people trying to resist the putschist elements. I don't know if that's true or not true. What I do know is that the Leningrad authorities rather quickly, although not immediately, rallied around on behalf of the democratic reform movement and against the putschists. Although the commander of the Leningrad military district went on television early to urge calm and to say that they were taking charge of the situation, he quickly backed down. And after conversations with Mr. Sobchak and others, and the chief of police, and we had gotten to know these people pretty well. Things had changed, as Ambassador Matlock said, so that Soviet authorities who would never have dreamed of setting foot in the residence there in Leningrad would come and have a drink and see a movie or whatever. So we knew the chief of police. We knew the KGB chief. We knew the commander of the Leningrad military district. And they did rally around. Sobchak came back from Moscow. I don't know exactly the circumstances under which he came back. Deputy mayor at that time was a retired Soviet Navy Admiral Shcherbakov, a nuclear submarine commander. And Shcherbakov told me later that they had gone up and sent for Sobchak to bring him back. They had to sort of find him and bring him back, which they did. But in any case, Sobchak, Shcherbakov is a rather conservative person, as you might imagine. But nonetheless, Sobchak, Shcherbakov, and even Mr. Yanov from the regional committee, party committee, came down to the television station the evening of the putsch. And that broadcast, in which they supported, they rallied people against the putschist, that broadcast was broadcast over a good deal of Russian territory. Leningrad TV was not exactly national TV, but it was not exactly local either. It had pretty wide coverage. And that TV broadcast, I'm quite sure, was a morale boost for the people in Moscow who were themselves trying to do the same thing. In the Baltic states, again, I left before the actual events of August 1991, but I do know that, as Ambassador Matlock had indicated, things had already gone along pretty far. The Soviet authorities were divided, I think, over how to exactly handle this incredible nationalism that grew rather quickly, starting around 1987, 1988, and from song festivals and things of that sort, and then blossoming into human chain demonstrations which extended all the way from Tallinn in Estonia down through Lithuania, and involving violence sometimes on the part of OMON elements and Soviet Army elements in the capital cities, with somewhat the exception of Tallinn in Estonia. The Estonian authorities even signed a treaty with the Russian Federation, and they themselves played a rather quieter role in the expression of their own nationalism. In Lithuania and in Latvia, the people, the nationalist leaders, were much more outspoken. They had taken control, basically, of the parliament buildings and had built barricades around them. When I used to go down to Lithuania especially, I had this great big billowing American car. I hated it, frankly, but it was certainly big and imposing, and we flew the flag. Consuls General had the right to fly the American flag on it, and we would drive that car up between the ranks of the Soviet tanks and armored personnel carriers on our way into the Parliament building itself. Local television was there, sometimes Leningrad television was there, and even television reporters from the Baltic states, the Scandinavian states were there, especially Finland was quite interested in what was going on. And this was all, they focused not on me, to be quite blunt, but on the American flag on this enormous American car. When you would approach, you parked the car, you'd approach the Parliament building, and there would be fellows with red armbands around their arm and around barrels of burning trash and so on, trying to keep warm, and they would be armed with a rifle or a shotgun. You would go inside, and you would find sleepy guys with their guns or shotguns sitting on sofas and chairs and whatnot, and then eventually you would find, in this case, or speaking of Lithuania, we'd find Mr. Landsbergis, who usually looked, just about as tired as a human being can look, but who was very appreciative of these visits and of the, somewhat vague but positive messages which we could convey from Washington. I think it did a lot for the morale of the nationalist leaders in the Baltic states, and it helped us to know what was going on, of course. And in Estonia, I wouldn't say it was all sweetness and light up there. I remember President Rutel once, who is not a bombastic man and not a real macho type either, to tell the truth, showing me a pistol in his pocket and saying, if they come for me, I'm prepared to resist. I'm not going to go peacefully. I mean, those are dramatic moments. Like Wayne said, diplomats, live for moments like that, and very, very moving, I must say. I don't have much more to say about these things. We saw them from our own somewhat restricted perspective, but we did see them from the standpoint not just of Northwest Russia and Leningrad, but also from the standpoint of those three Baltic countries, very brave people, and it was really an honor for me to be able to work with them and to report what we saw back to Washington and to the embassy in Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, thank you very much, and I will try to pick up a bit from where all three have brought us. I would like simply to talk a bit about the kind of context that I feel the people in the United States trying to cope with the collapse of the Soviet Union and its consequences faced, and the sort of dynamics that were at work over the periods, let's say, from the August coup on through at least the middle of the 90s. And I think there's first of all one point that everyone really kind of has to bear in mind, because it was very much present, certainly for all of us in the embassy or when I was back in Washington, dealing with all of the former Soviet space. And that was that the United States had sort of two parallel sets of thoughts going on almost continuously as we tried to cope with this sort of revolutionary rapid change that we saw going on in this whole part of the world. On the one hand, we had what Jack has called cleanup diplomacy, but really had dimensions even beyond cleanup. For instance, we were engaged from the summer on with the Soviet government, and then immediately its successor, when we could sort of figure out just exactly what that was going to be, in a series of negotiations over what would happen to the Soviet nuclear arsenal. Now, agreements had been reached. Were they going to be negotiated on and simply developed? Suddenly we had more states, players in the equation. How were they to be brought in? The amount of energy and time that was taken up in trying to ensure that we didn't lose, in some sense, the framework to deal with that terribly, terribly dangerous phenomena of the Cold War nuclear arsenal, tactical nuclear, strategic nuclear weapons spread over Eurasia, was a preoccupying part of the whole policy discussion in the United States. The second was, for instance, that the Middle East occupied a very significant role in what we were discussing with Moscow during the fall of 1991. The Madrid conference took place. We were engaged in very active diplomacy on the Arab-Israeli dispute, so forth. And to some extent here, inertia played a role. I mean, the Soviet Union had always been a major player in the Middle East. And the concept that somehow Moscow wasn't going to play that role was difficult to accept. Moreover, it was even more difficult when they were playing a constructive role, frankly. The idea that finally we were able to work together, and yet maybe we didn't have the diplomatic options to make something work, was a great challenge. Now, I give you this only as a set of considerations and thoughts and bureaucratic time that was a major factor in the way the United States responded to all of these developments that you've heard described. And what I'm really suggesting is that, number one, the first preoccupation was not always just what was happening to Moscow or these pieces of the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union. There were other large issues out there, and they tended to, if you will, balance off what might have been the perfectly logical and rational thing to do if you only thought about how to respond to today's change in Moscow. The second thing that seemed to me very important in sort of shaping the American response is that bureaucracies do not do well with revolutions. The pace of change that we all were living through from August 1991 on for the next few years was so rapid that the United States bureaucratic response, that is, appropriating money to get something sent or, to divine assistance programs, was always so far behind the events on the ground that, for the most part, those of us who were on the ground found ourselves, in essence, wondering what was going on in Washington because what they were talking about never showed up where we were. Mm-hmm. This is partly because Congress thinks it does something when it appropriates money. Well, it does, but it doesn't do anything 8,000 or 5,000 miles away, not until the money shows up. And that was usually a year or a year and 2 years later, et cetera. So that the response time lag in dealing with crisis or, if you will, the developmental issues that were going to face the U.S. government was a real problem. Most of us, I think, who were on the ground or who dealt with it in a daily way understood that we were always behind the curve. But the systems were simply not compatible. I used to tell people that, in Moscow in those years, a day was a week was a month, and a month was a year. And our system back here just was never functioning on the same calendar. So this had an impact on shaping the responses. For one thing, it tended to focus you, if you were trying to address issues and be responsive or to shape a direction, it focused you on the tools at hand, what you could use in time or could have at your disposal in time. And so this often got us into the situation where the problem was defined by, the sort of old idea that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And to some extent, that meant that economic tools, loans, things that could be done reasonably expeditiously in the international and financial institutions and so on, those became the tools of policy, even though they often were not necessarily the ones that were perhaps best adapted to the issues before us. A third factor that was always at play, and I think made a huge difference in the way we approached the developments sort of post-breakup and into the early 90s, was domestic politics here at home. And international politics with our allies and the sort of whole mindset that we inherited from the end of the 20th century. This was, clean-up diplomacy and clean-up politics big time. And it was a chance when everybody felt you could right every wrong and tidy up every imperfect situation left over since 1945. And so we got an awful lot injected into American policy that I think really, in some ways, made certain decisions or certain issues very difficult to think about conceptually. I think the singularly most difficult one was the approach that emerged as almost the sort of gospel in Washington regarding the independent states of the former Soviet Union. Now, it was one of the great strategic decisions made by the United States in the sort of turn of the new year, 1992, was to recognize diplomatically each of the former republics, say they were independent states, and treat them accordingly. Nobody else, more or less, was until we started. Many of them themselves weren't quite sure what it meant, and I remember getting a call from the Tajikistan Minister of Foreign Affairs asking for the forms to apply for diplomatic recognition. I mean, this was really a time in which what the United States said, to some extent, and what it did in those very critical moments, shaped the entire international system of that part of the world. Because we said, you are independent states, we recognize you, where's your ambassador, etc. But one of the great sort of, I would say, shortcomings that followed from much of that was that this became almost an obsession. And the obsession was that we couldn't even speak of something or think conceptually of anything that would look like you were going to restore the Soviet Union or the empire or whatever. And so we got into a situation where I could not put in a memo here in Washington the term CIS. It had to be new independent states. And we were hamstrung, it seemed to me, in many, many respects, by what I used to call terminal bilateralism. We could basically work bilaterally with each one of these states, but to talk about or to discuss somehow this sort of broader context of what arrangements would come to govern the relations between and amongst the peoples of that region and how we would deal with the different arrangements that really ought to be made was a topic that just never could really get on the agenda. And I think this made it often difficult to deal with a number of the kinds of developmental and political issues in that region, because we never really had a regional policy. We always had a bilateral policy with everybody. And the final point I simply wanted to suggest is that what happened as the Soviet Union fell apart was a phenomenon for which, frankly, the United States was totally unprepared in terms of a response. Now, I'm not here to suggest that we didn't do a pretty good job in response, and I think in many ways we did. But in terms of what I would suppose today we would call state building or state rebuilding or some such, we really didn't have the tools and we didn't have the conceptual framework to deal with the challenges that were put in front of us. I think it's almost impossible for people who didn't live through this or were not part of it to have a feel for the total disorientation of a society that woke up one morning and said that basically everything that it had the day before was delegitimated, and that everything that was going forward was going to start over. And that essentially is what happened to people in every corner of the former Soviet Union. And whether you pick Christmas Day 1991 or the 8th of December, I don't care. But it happened when, in essence, the flag came down and everybody understood there was a new system. Because the republics didn't change overnight. I mean, this was different. But basically, the whole rationale for the system was delegitimated, and people were asked to start over. Now, that resulted in a number of reactions. Of course, internal people were at sea and they were looking for whatever anchors they could find. But one anchor that was often out there and thrown out more often than probably was wise was the United States. That we somehow would have the answer to what you did next. Having thrown over the communist system, what did you put in its place? And I remember getting very seriously questioned by senior people in the Russian government and other governments with the question essentially, could you tell us how to make a market economy? Or could you tell us, how to set up a democracy? The fact of the matter is, we didn't have the answers, and yet we were under great pressures to provide answers to many different queries and questioners, which we, I think, did our best to do, but often fell short in terms of accomplishment. So I think the reality is that whatever shortcomings there are in American policy in the 90s, and there were many, it was more than anything else a simple fact that we were ill-equipped institutionally, as a government, as a society, to take on the question of how do you cope with something that was at least as big, if not bigger, than the American Depression in the 30s. We just didn't have the structures to do it. We didn't have the intellectual construct to do it. And we certainly didn't have the bureaucracy in place to make an effective job of it. And so we used what we could, and we did what we could. And it, of course, disappointed. It fell short in many ways. Now, there were many cases in which we assisted, and I think we did a good job. But it was never possible, in my view, to meet the expectations that the Russian people and the Russian government had for what we could provide in the way of a way through from the end of one system to the flowering of another. And as Wayne said, and I totally agree, 15 years in is not very far into the system. We've got a long way yet to go. And one final concluding comment that I decided I really should make to this group. The one thing that I learned on the 19th of August, 1991, is that you can never underestimate the role of serendipity and pure chance in the way things will develop. Probably the most, there were two things that stood out to me during those days of the putsch that I think were extraordinary. One was that they didn't prevent Yeltsin from moving to the White House in Moscow. This is real ineptitude. And they managed to create themselves an opponent who basically ensured that the effort to take the government under control of a different group of people was not going to succeed. And the second was CNN. And there's one story about CNN which has always remained with me because it almost symbolized the role of modern communications and the fact that you can't repeat history when certain things have changed. At one point, and I think it was on the second day of the coup, Yanayev called Nazarbayev in Almaty, and in essence said, "Well, Nursultan, what are you going to do? We haven't heard from you. We are in charge, and we are looking for a statement of support and for you to ensure that everything is well in Kazakhstan." And Nazarbayev was reported to have said, "Well, how are things going in Moscow? Is everything under control? Is all good and so?" And he got this song and dance from Yanayev about how there was nothing going on, everything was fully under control, and they were just making sure that the meetings worked right and so forth. Nazarbayev was sitting there watching CNN, and he knew that there was a very different picture from what he was being told over the phone. And I think somehow that's a fitting way to understand, in some ways, an awful lot that happened in that peculiar period from August through the end of 1991. There was just way, way too much sort of serendipity in much that was going on for people to cope with. So I'll end with that.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Steve Cohen. I understand there are about a dozen people in the other room, and I think we have a dozen seats here. So maybe while Steve is speaking, if he doesn't mind, we'll have people drift in from the other room, so it'll make the question and answer period easier. So the people in the other room can start coming in. Just try to be quiet, taking your seats. Steve?
Should I proceed?
Yes.
Not only are we all from the South or Midwest, but Ambassador Collins and I went to IU, as did the new Secretary of Defense. So it's, since they probably don't want too close association with me, I'll refrain from calling it the IU Mafia. But it does testify to the Midwest and the South. This is a good event, and I congratulate Blair Rubel and the Kennan Institute, because this subject hasn't been discussed seriously in the United States enough, if at all, during the last 15 years. And this is a very good beginning, and I think we should all be grateful to Blair Rubel. I'm happy to be a part of it, but I suddenly realize that I'm the only non-diplomat up here, for better or worse. That means either I can be academic or I can be undiplomatic. And I'll make up my mind as I go along. I want to use my 15 minutes to comment very briefly on three aspects of the topic that we have before us today. I've just finished, or coming close to finish, I will never finish, but I feel like I've almost finished a large book, partly involving this subject. And to do it, I've gone through an enormous amount of Western and Russian literature in search of other people's explanations of why the Soviet Union ended, surely one of the great explanatory questions of the 20th century. And I want to report briefly on the explanations I found there, because there are quite a few. Secondly, I want to give you my evaluation of the persuasiveness or not persuasiveness of those explanations. And finally, I want to end by commenting on the discussion that's underway in Russia today on what they call the plusi and minusi, the pluses and minuses of the end of the Soviet Union, a discussion that very much is not going on in the United States for obvious reasons. Two prefatory generalizations. In the American literature, on the end of the Soviet Union, there is a near consensus now that it was inevitable. But this is a clear case of what social scientists call hindsight bias, or the fallacy of retrospective determinism. Consider, for example, what three very eminent American scholars said over about a decade about what the profession of Soviet studies thought. In 1990, the first said that the end of the Soviet Union was, quote, absolutely unthinkable. That was 1990, before Ambassador Matlock wrote his memo. In 1998, the second scholar says of the profession, quote, nobody really expresses any surprise that the Soviet Union collapsed. And in 2002, the third scholar tells us that, quote, the prevailing view in the profession is that the Soviet breakup was inevitable. How did we eminent scholars go from unthinkable to inevitable? Was it revelation? Was it hindsight bias? Or was it, and you people in Washington would know better than I, political fashion? My second generalization is the analytical bias inherent in the typical formulation of the question. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? No, you can't use the word collapse in asking the question. It may be the answer to the question. If you say collapse, it prejudges the question by implying that it was some inherent defect and probably an inescapable one. So you ask the question, or at least I have in this book, simply, why did the Soviet Union end? And in asking that question and going through the American and Russian literature, I found about 10 different explanations, all of them equally certain of their cogency and validity. But you can narrow them down to 6. 1, that the system was doomed from the beginning by some inherent genetic defect. 2, the system was overthrown between 1985 and 91 by a popular anti-Soviet revolution, either a democratic revolution in Russia from below or ethnic separationist nationalist revolutions in the other 14 ethnic republics. 3, the system fell victim to an unworkable economic system, which went into crisis and then collapsed in 1991. 4, the system fell victim to Russia's long tradition of intelligentsia extremism, that Gorbachev's moderate gradualist reformation, he called it perestroika, unleashed inadvertently this old tradition, and the extremism of the intelligentsia destroyed Gorbachev's perestroika just as it had destroyed every attempt to reform Russia without catastrophe since Alexander II. In other words, a recurrent outcome in Russian history. You don't find that in the United States. You find it, of course, in Russia, that explanation. Fifth, that the end of the Soviet Union was a classic case of the event-making role of leaders in history. In this case, Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And sixth, nabarot, just the opposite, it was an elite-driven event. That it was the Soviet nomenclatura, the high elite itself, that ended the Soviet Union, for whatever reason. Now, in my manuscript, I examined these six explanations at considerable length in the context of Soviet history and politics, and I rule out the first four as simply not cogent. Briefly, here's why. There are two conceptions of an inherent doomsday mechanism that destroyed the Soviet Union. One is an original sin of ideology or criminality. This school is associated with the late Martin Malia. The problem with this is it's theological, and therefore it's not suitable for historical analysis, so I move on. The other is more serious, that the Soviet Union was an empire, quote, and all empires end. Soviet Union ended because it was an empire. The problem with this is twofold, and it's empirical. At home, we're not talking about Eastern Europe. At home, the Soviet state did have some characteristics similar to those of traditional empires, but it had many fundamental characteristics that were not typical of empires. Secondly, the Soviet Union did not end, as had almost all traditional empires, in military defeat and colonial rebellion on the periphery. The Soviet Union was entered by the metropolis, the center, Moscow, the Kremlin. So I don't find this explanatory as an explanation for the end of the Soviet Union. As for popular revolutions from below, in a word, there were none. None. Not even the semblance of one, even though this is a very popular assertion in the literature. As evidenced by many opinion surveys of the period, by election results, and even the signs carried at street demonstrations, and we all saw them there at the time, there was no anti-Soviet revolution in Russia itself. None. None. Not even the miners in 1989, 1990. They all wanted to change, they wanted to reform the system. In the other 14 republics, there were, as I understand it, not my specialty, but I've read a lot, popular ethnic separationist movements only in the Baltics, part of the Caucasus, and arguably, though some people disagree, in western Ukraine. That was it. These exceptions constituted barely 10% of the entire Soviet territories, peoples, and resources. That is hardly a fatal loss. Moreover, we need to remember, though people have forgotten it, that in March 1991 there was a referendum. And there was a large turnout. And of the large turnout, it wasn't in all the republics, 9, I believe, but 76% of the people voted in favor of keeping the Union. Now, regarding the economic explanation, there are also two problems. No large modern state has ever collapsed because its economy collapsed. It just never happened in history. It didn't happen in the United States during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And equally significantly or tellingly, it did not happen in post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s, when the economic collapse was far greater than anything that had happened in the Soviet Union. Moreover, and this we need to be accurate about, the economic system that went into crisis in 1990-91 was no longer the Soviet economic system. It was already significantly dismantled. So if there was an economic causality to the Soviet breakup, it wasn't in the Soviet economic system, but in what had ensued from it. Fourth, as for Russia's tradition of destructive intelligentsia radicalism, I was drawn to this explanation in the beginning simply because so many of my Soviet acquaintances when I lived in Russia in the late 80s were radical, increasingly extremist, former party intellectuals. They used to call them repentant noblemen in the 19th century. These were repentant Communist Party functionaries. And that certainly happened. They became exceedingly radical, particularly in Moscow and Leningrad. But they were a tiny minority of the entire Soviet intelligentsia, almost unrepresented among the provincial intelligentsia, disliked by the provincial intelligentsia and the Soviet people in large, and they had no influence or power apart from that given to them by the two commanding figures of the period, Gorbachev and Yeltsin. So that then brings me to the role of leadership and my own explanation of the end of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's political role, and I think Jack Matlock adumbrated this argument. I don't know if he'll go as far as I do, but Gorbachev's political role was the primary causal factor because of the changes he introduced in the system between 85 and 89, none of the other factors cited in the literature would have come into play. Not one of them, including Yeltsin's role. But in 1989, Yeltsin now emerged, because of Gorbachev, as another potentially event-making figure, and what ensued was an absolutely extraordinary situation in history. At an extraordinary moment in Russian history, 1989, 1991, two leaders of absolutely extraordinary political will met on the scene at the very same time. Gorbachev, many of you won't like this formulation, but I believe it to be correct. Gorbachev, a leader of extraordinary will to reform, obsessive will to reform. Yeltsin, with an equally strong political will for power. Bang. And the struggle that ensued led Yeltsin to the Belavesh Forest 15 years ago on December 8th to abolish Gorbachev's state. Now, that's the essential explanation for me, but, and this is a very large but, it is not a sufficient explanation, because you have to ask the question, why did the still powerful and intact high Soviet nomenclatura prevent Yeltsin's struggle for power to go so far as to abolish their own, the nomenclatura's state? Why didn't they get rid of him? And the answer is, you know this, that at that moment they were too busy seizing property. They were more interested, this begins in late 89, and it's a frenzy by 1991, more interested in privatizing the state's great assets than in defending or even preserving the state. Nor, and this is very important, was this the nomenclatura of the ethnic republics outside Russia. This was the Russian nomenclatura itself. The other nomenclatura, as we just heard from Ambassador Collins, were obedient to Moscow to the very end, including Kravchuk and all the rest. They were scared. But I want to be clear. There are many people in Russia today, intellectuals, historians, who argue that the elites destroyed the system because they had already become proto-capitalist elites. No, they were not the primary factor. They were the enabling factor. They permitted the main causal factor, first Gorbachev, then Yeltsin, to end the system. In the minute I have left, this. In Russia today, there is an utterly fascinating, if we can be empathetic, passionate discussion about what was gained and what was lost with the Soviet Union, the pluses and minuses. In the United States, we don't discuss it because we see only pluses, though some of the panelists have hinted that there might be a few minuses. In Russia, though, according to the latest poll, 60% of those surveyed today, in the last week, still regret the end of the Soviet Union. It's a large figure, 60% in Russia. I think we can deconstruct it as follows. Many of these people simply regret it in a sentimental way, like we all regret our lost youth. And their emotion is expressed in the famous adage that even Putin has quoted, that it didn't originate with him. Anyone who does not regret the end of the Soviet Union has no heart. Anyone who thinks it can be reconstructed has no head. And that's a perfectly healthy, normal reaction. But I would guess about 30% of that 60% is bitter, because it believes that only minuses resulted from the end of the Soviet Union, and that the end of the Soviet Union was the result of a malevolent conspiracy, domestic, foreign, or both. And it's a powerful force in Russia, and if things turn worse in Russia in terms of lives, it will certainly become a political factor driving a very wrathful politics. Finally, I think, though, that we as American scholars ought to think about, talk about, and engage in a discussion regarding the other regret that we hear in Russia among historians and the intelligentsia, that what Russia lost with the Soviet Union was yet another chance to modernize politically and economically through gradual rather than catastrophic means. That was what was lost, that a reforming Soviet Union was yet another opportunity missed for Russia to modernize without it ending in catastrophe. There are also people in Russia who believe that if the reforming Soviet Union had continued, the world order today would be safer and more benevolent than it is. Considering the role that the United States has played in both of these realms, in Russia and in the relationship with Russia, and in my judgment on balance, a detrimental role, I think it's our obligation to engage our Russian colleagues in this discussion. And maybe we're beginning here today. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank Steve for the kind words, but in fact they should be directed towards Joe Dresden, who pulled this program together. So
Sorry, Joe.
Want to mention Joe's role in this. I want to begin the discussion, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions from the floor. But I'm struck as I listen to the panelists that, leaving aside a moment the reality on the ground in Russia and Ukraine and the Caucasus and Central Asia, we've heard really a discussion about the conceptual limitations of dealing with historic events, the conceptual limitations on policymakers and on academics. And what, at the same time, as we've heard about these intellectual limitations, which are inevitable because in both diplomacy and in social science research, you're looking for the most probable outcomes based on what came before, and truly historic events are, by definition, low probability events. So you're not looking for the low probability event. At the same time, I think one can make a credible argument that at the moment of the end of the Soviet Union, when changes were coming every day, and a day was a week was a month was a year, in fact, the intellectual response and the diplomatic response was perhaps closer and more flexible and more responsive to what was going on than what happened when we slowly moved into not just cleanup diplomacy, but relations as normal. When we get into 93, 94, 95, presumably we are beginning to deal with a world that is more predictable, and yet one can agree or disagree with the policy of hoping that there was a Soviet Union of 12 states voluntarily united by a common agreement that we're moving towards more freedom. One can agree or disagree with that, but that's at least a credible policy response. But the confusion really sets in much later, and the confusion seems to set in over misunderstanding, I guess, because people were moving along so quickly. If Steve is right, if it was really about elites beginning to grab property in 1989, we didn't necessarily pick up on that. But I would like to ask each of the speakers very briefly, looking back, what in hindsight should we have picked up on that we didn't pick up on? Did we really privilege the nuclear question too much? Or in fact, are all the problems that have come since really minor in comparison to what would have happened had we not really borne down on the nuclear issue? So looking back, starting with the point of view that at the time we weren't going to get it right anyway, when we began to have time to step back and think, what should we have picked up on that we didn't?
Well, if I would look at the time that I'm talking about, which is up to the failed coup in 91, others have more experience with the later time. I would say that, I think if it had been realized in Washington by the first Bush administration, to the degree that we sort of felt it in our guts in the embassy, that the Cold War really was over. A lot of problems were still out there. Europe was still divided and whatnot. But nevertheless, there was an entirely different spirit in the diplomacy. we were looking for win-win ways to settle these problems. And, this was very clear to us in Moscow by January '89. It was not clear to the incoming Bush administration. And, I think there was an exchange fairly early on when at one point Scowcroft said on one of the Sunday interview programs, the Cold War is not over. And the New York Times in an editorial did an editorial, the Cold War is over. Well, one could make a logical argument. Looking at the past, of course it wasn't over. Europe was still divided. There were many problems. We didn't have the START agreements yet, and so on and so on. But as I said, I think we had moved by the end of '88 to a situation where we recognized what the problems were. We were negotiating off the same agenda, so to speak, and we were looking not to defeat each other, but ways we could solve common problems. That was an entirely different spirit from the zero-sum game which marked the Cold War. Now, one of the proposals I made in February '89 was we expand our agenda to much more active economic consultation and cooperation. This was at a time, and of course this was rejected as premature. I know Jim Baker thought that the Soviets just wanted in the international economic organizations to act as spoilers. So at a time when I suppose we could have had the most influence if we had paid attention not to the theories that we had, but to their reality and trying to help them cooperatively to move to that, I think that may have been a missed opportunity. Also, I would say, reinforcing Jim Collins' comment about the difficulties in moving bureaucracy. I have, an example that may be comparatively minor in the overall set of things, but it was quite striking. One of the first recommendations I made in early '89 in the new Bush administration was that we establish 4 to 6 consulates very rapidly, because we had an embassy in Moscow, we had a consulate general in Leningrad, we had an advance party to set up a consulate general in Kiev, and that was all. And I spoke to the Secretary of State, and he said, sounds good to me, why don't you take it up with the President? So they both agreed. The President turned to Scowcroft and said, I guess, will anybody object to this? And he said, well, the FBI will want extra personnel to watch the Soviet missions. And they said, well, we can live with that, and go ahead and do it. So I go back to State and thinking that, well, at least within a year, we'd have some new consulates. 3 months later, I asked the Deputy Secretary for Management what he was doing, and he said, oh, yes, we're going to put it in the '92 budget. This was 1989 I'm talking about. And I said, well, we've got 11 time zones in this country. It's beginning to fall apart. I need them now. And he said, look, Jack, I've got to open Bratislava and Leipzig first, and I don't have funds to earn any more in the Soviet Union for the next 3 years. Okay, well, when 92 came, we had to open, what was the count? Something
14
like 13
embassies.
in addition, to what we already had. So we had to do it with very little preparation. The sluggishness of the bureaucracy, even, as I say, I had the Secretary of State and the President saying doing it, and you couldn't get it done.
2 points. First, I think the priority given to the nuclear issue was entirely appropriate. What we were seeking to do was that there be secure custodianship for this enormous arsenal. And secure custodianship, basically, we defined as being single custodianship. And that really involved getting nuclear weapons out of 3 countries, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, into Russian custodianship. If we had flubbed that, the consequences would be so enormous that I can't imagine there would be any retrospective thing. Well, maybe we shouldn't have given it so much priority. I don't have any quibbles about that. Where I think we really did move too quickly was in according legitimacy of the United States to all 15. And and some people will be shocked to hear me say that I think according diplomatic recognition gives legitimacy, but in these cases, the word of the United States actually did do that. But we were treating all 15 as if they were all as legitimate and prepared for independence as the 3 Baltic states, and that objectively was not true. I think we should have established a much more provisional relationship, particularly with the Central Asian states, and that we should have created a series of much more strenuous benchmarks that I think might have helped to deal with a very real issue that Jack addressed, which was that Gorbachev was trying to bring reform into these Union republics, and the end of the Soviet Union helped enshrine a bunch of old nomenclatura types in power, some of them still there. I think if we had not moved so quickly to give the legitimacy of American recognition to all 15, I think we could perhaps have had a more positive impact on that process.
I don't have any big picture comment from the Leningrad Consulate General, but when Steve was talking, I was reminded of a quote that we'll find in the French ambassador Paleolog's memoirs written during the time of the World War I on the eve of the Revolution. And it's from the French philosopher de Maistre, if I pronounce it correctly, something like, woe to bad governments, triple woe to bad governments that try to reform.
I think it's important to reemphasize one thing, and here I go back to the coup. There was no inevitability that that coup could not succeed. It didn't, and it was pretty ineptly done. But as one who woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning on the 19th of August to be told that Gorbachev was under control in the South, and, you know, these guys were in charge, and the military showed up in town, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it was not exactly persuasive that this was all going to go Yeltsin's way. Now, I think in that sense, all of this discussion about could the Soviet Union have stayed on has to be thought of very carefully. I mean, it might not have gone on forever, but I have always believed that it was fully possible that the Soviet Union could still have been with us 15 years from the day of the coup. It would have been a different place. We would have had different characters. But, I mean, the fact of the matter was that these institutions were not dead. And what Gorbachev was really up against by the time the coup happened was that he was beginning to touch things that really mattered to people. You know, the perestroika or the glasnost and so on was all fine. But when he started to move, you know, real power around, like ownership of assets and so on, this was getting to be trouble. And it brought a very strong reaction. Now, so I mean, my first point is historical inevitability is never a good idea, you know, from the point of view of the day before you know what happens. And it certainly wasn't in those days. And in terms of the nuclear issue, I agree with Wayne. I think there's absolutely no question that no matter what else we were able to accomplish or not accomplish, to have neglected that issue would have been catastrophic. Because it was perfectly clear to me and to some of the colleagues in the audience who were involved in negotiating this business and trying to harness the resources to get a handle on it, it was perfectly clear that the parties directly involved, the Ukrainian leadership, the Russian leadership, the Kazakhstan and Belarus, were not going to do this by themselves. They simply would never have got this done. And had we let it go on and fester, I'm convinced you would have 4 nuclear powers, or 3 at least, in that part of the world. And we might have tactical nuclear weapons and all kinds of other things scattered around that would be extremely upsetting. So I think that there was no question that for the United States, and we were probably the only ones who could do it, the role of catalyst and basically the sort of goader and negotiator to make sure that we got through that problem was problem number 1. If I had an issue that I thought took up so much time that was absolutely wasted effort, It was the God knows how many dozens of hours of negotiating over CFE levels that went on, beyond the Soviet collapse. I mean, this, frankly, was nonsense. Getting the Soviet troops out of East Europe, conventional forces in Europe treaty. I mean, this was a perfectly good Cold War counting mechanism to make sure everybody sort of knew what each other had. It was totally ridiculous to spend the time the diplomats did on it after the Soviet Union collapsed. But I can't tell you how many hours were spent. It's more than I would care to think. Anyway, thanks.
Steve?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I guess it would depend on the following. What would you have done differently? It would depend on what you're looking back, you think the best outcome would have been. If you take the view, it's not a view widely held in the United States, that it would have been better for everybody, for a voluntary reforming Soviet Union to have continued to exist, then the so-called long pause, as I think it was called, between the time that President Reagan and Jack left and the first President Bush thought it over. I was flabbergasted. I was asked to come to Camp David in November 1989 on the eve of Malta. Malta is usually given by Cherniaev, and I think Jack's accepted this too, as the declaration of the end of the Cold War at Malta, but I'm not sure, but somewhere around that time. But I went to, the idea was I was supposed to debate an eminent colleague who will remain nameless from Harvard, but was known for the view that Gorbachev was a great danger to the West in 1989, and I was supposed to make the argument that no, we should meet Gorbachev halfway and end the Cold War. But what was interesting was not what I had to say, but that this was a Bush administration, they were all there, every one of them, in profound disagreement about this. I mean, absolutely didn't have any fix. Gorbachev had been in power for 4 years, had dismantled the Communist Party dictatorship, and they still thought it might be a trick. So, I mean, I guess if the argument is, would you have wanted to see Gorbachev succeed as a reformer and hold the Union together in a democratic and voluntary way, then we would have needed to help him with money. And that would have meant giving him money when he went to London in July 1991. I've talked to some of the coup makers, I've talked to the Gorbachev people, and I've talked to people who think they understand it. If he had come home with a commitment from the West for serious money from London, the G7, in July 1991, the coup makers never would have moved in August. They couldn't have had. But in order to give him money, the will to make that commitment to him would have had to continued Reagan's position on Gorbachev and not have been interrupted by this long pause. Now, if you're happy the Soviet Union ended, things worked out just fine. If you think things would have been better, at least in Russia and some of the other former republics, and maybe in world affairs, then you have to ask yourself, what in the world was the first Bush administration thinking about for its first 11 months?
I can answer that. Bush was worried about the right wing of the Republican Party. And as usual, American foreign policy is driven primarily by domestic politics.
What I'm going to do, because we have about 20 minutes, I'm going to take 2, 3, 4 questions. We'll see how long they are, and then we'll come up and have the panelists respond. And the first question is right here. Anatoly, please identify yourself.
My name is Anatoly Adamishin. I am a retired Russian ambassador, currently guest scholar in the United States Institute of Peace. Let me tell that it's a subtle pleasure to attend such an intellectual banquet. And as many of you know, the most popular Russian question is, who's to blame? It is very popular and in the same time useless question, because usually the consequences, the lessons are not drawn, even when the answers are correct. And the consolation that it's not only our prerogative. And if I may make my counts, I believe that the Soviet Union was doomed for 80% when Gorbachev came to power. And it was doomed by, as Wayne Mary said, by misrule of the Soviet rulers from Stalin to Chernenko. And to pull out the Soviet Union from this situation, we needed a genius, or better, a couple of them. But the 19 million members Communist Party produced two leaders, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and the tremendous fighting between them. And the divided house perishes. Still, I remain an admirer of Gorbachev because, paraphrasing Marx, he tried to storm the heaven. And the responsibility for all what happened is entirely ours. But did the United States help the Gorbachev's huge project and unprecedented project? My answer is no. Could they do it? My answer is yes. And in the Soviet Union and after in Russia, there was a tremendous good position towards the United States. And unfortunately, what we are seeing now, when Russia and the United States again is a problem to each other, I believe has its legs, as we say, growing from this period as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go down to the front row, Howard, and then we'll try to move towards the back.
Should I face forward or?
Face forward.
It's hard to say from this position. I was in Russia in the spring of '92 and stayed away from Moscow and stayed away from the embassy and let my Russian hosts show me their country. And I have to say, I was out in Nizhny Novgorod and Arzymas 16 and down the Volga, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that was clear is that the Russians were shipping all kinds of things down the river from Nizhny, heavy armaments and tanks and armed personnel carriers and who knows what all. So I'm not quite sure that we really did get a handle on all of those weapons as early as has been suggested. But the real question I want to ask is this one. In my roaming around that area of Russia, I saw no sign of democracy being created or of free markets evolving whatsoever. And when I got back, I read Steve Cohen's analyses from that period and found them to be the most accurate from my perspective because they emphasize continuity rather than change. So the real question I wanted to ask you is whether the people in the embassy really believed that you were building democracy and free markets during this period. Were there any other alternatives that might have been considered, or is that the only consideration that we as Americans who truly believe in all of those things could have countenanced in those days?
Why don't you answer, and then and so Mark and I can start moving back. We're going back towards the back.
Others can answer regarding the matter of free markets and building democracy because that didn't come up until really after the Soviet Union collapsed. When I was there, we were trying to end the Cold War, to prevent a nuclear confrontation, and we thought to do so, we needed to press the Soviet Union to open up, to be more responsible to its people. Now, you can call it democratization or whatnot, and stop, in effect, lift the Iron Curtain. And of course, control the arms, which were a threat. Yes, that was what we were concentrating on. The matter of democracy and markets came later, in my experience.
Well, I think we weren't building anything. If it was going to be built, it was going to be done by the Russians. And what we were confronted with was a group of leaders who came in by the time you got there, who said that's exactly what they wanted to do. Now, were they rational or right or sensible? I think in hindsight they were overly ambitious, shall we say. But I would simply say that this was no more imposed by the United States as an idea than a lot of the other developments. I mean, the real problem was we were told or given a laundry list of aspirations by the incoming new rulers of the Russian Federation. which was pretty staggering. And they wanted help in trying to do it. Now, did we manage to respond adequately? I'd say certainly it's a very mixed record. But I can't quite accept the premise that it was we who were trying to build the democracy. I mean, the problem we had was these folks were trying to do it. We were providing what we could, and by 1992 we were providing mighty little in that regard. Most of the things that were, if you want to call it democracy building, so it didn't really get underway until after the Freedom Support Act, and that was then a year at least after that. So you're really talking about what was it that the Yeltsin people and the people there were able to do about talking about building a democracy in that first 2 years? And the answer was more than we might have thought, but a lot less than was necessary.
Okay, we're going to go towards the back.
I'm John Diamond. I'm a scholar in residence here. I think I can anticipate your answers because so many of you have talked about the dynamic of unpredictability about the end or the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I wondered if you all could reflect on the controversy that Senator Moynihan, a founder of the Wilson Center, brought up, which is to say the alleged failure by the CIA to predict the collapse.
You would touch on it, but we'll come back. Let's take Steve, and then Joe will come down here next, and then over here.
A follow-up on Mr. Cohen's point about if only Gorbachev had gotten this...
Identify
yourself. I'm sorry, Stephen Shore, PBGC. If only Gorbachev had gotten this financial commitment in July 1991, was the in terms of bureaucratic inertia, would the Soviet bureaucracy, having these Western funds, been able to apply them productively, or would they have just disappeared into private hands?
Dr. Berger?
Ed Berger. Wayne Mary alluded to the importance of the social environment and demography and health, for example. There was a proposal, and he referred to a proposal by George Soros to help do something about that. There was an earlier proposal in 1992 by Jeffrey Sachs, and I speak not of the shock therapy issue, but in fact of a proposal for a large sum of money to be devoted to the economic transition in the face of the assumption of the Soviet and Russian debts by the Russian Federation. A third of that was to have been spent on something called a social fund. He was not persuasive. And if I recall, Stephen Cohen, you had some critical remarks to make at the time about that very matter. Is that something that we should think about again? I guess my persuasion is that we should have thought about it.
And why don't we take this gentleman right here, and then we'll come back up.
Can you hear me? My name's Terrence Byrne. I'm retired from the Department of State, INR, and I'd like to sketch a hypothesis and ask the panelists to comment on it. Gorbachev, it seems to me, was a convinced communist who wanted to reform the USSR into a communist state that would not rely on state terror or the apparatus of propaganda. And when he dismantled the apparatus of propaganda and did away with state terror, the system collapsed because it had been held together simply by fear and by myth.
Okay, Jack, maybe you can take the first question about the CIA, and Steve, maybe you can comment on any of the last three, but I think maybe, Jim, you can comment on the question about the Sachs proposal, too, and our colleagues can jump in. So, Jack?
Well, I don't think I have much to add to what I said before. And maybe some weren't here because it was early on. The fact is, our government understood very well what was happening, and one could not predict from one day to the other how long this would go. But as I said, I sent my first message in June 1990, recommending that the United States government prepare for the contingency that the Soviet Union could break up. The reason the CIA never made that a prediction, number one, not everybody in the CIA agreed that that was the case. But number two, and I think most who by then were persuaded, but number two, if they had, that was the last thing in the world we wanted, because any formal determination of that sort or prediction by the CIA would have leaked immediately, particularly if it had been conveyed to Congress or to senators such as Senator Moynihan, and it would have stopped the whole reform process. I mean, there would have been a coup against Gorbachev, and it would have succeeded. You have to understand that, these things, I think there is a principle in science that, under some circumstances, simply observing something, you actually affect the outcome. And intelligence assessments, when they are known, particularly something like that, a second conclusion would have been that we wanted it to happen, and we didn't want it to happen. I mean, everybody would have thought, well, they were predicting it, they're going to try to make it happen. We were doing what little we could to keep it from happening, at least in our view. I think that's, but if it means that our government didn't understand what was going on, that's incorrect. I think we did, and we even had news before the coup occurred that there would probably be a coup, and even of the people in it. We tried to warn Gorbachev without naming the people, and he didn't take it seriously. So on the whole, I think we did understand what was going on. But even if you knew there was going to be a coup, you couldn't be sure whether it would succeed or not. Though in my last press conference, which was on the record in Moscow in August, it was in August, early August 1991, I was asked the question, and I said that there could well be attempts to reverse the course that Gorbachev had taken, but if they happened, I thought they would fail. It was never quoted in the U.S. press, although I was on the record.
Jim, you wanted to add a footnote.
Just as a very short answer to your question on the CIA, all I can tell you is that outgoing DCM Collins in the late summer of 1990 got his briefings. And I was told that it was some probability that one Baltic state might get a degree of autonomy within 5 years.
I remember that.
Wayne, if you want to jump in, and then we'll
Well, first, to be fair to people, what we have are intelligence agencies, not wisdom agencies. If these agencies had predicted the breakup of the Soviet Union, they might very well have been wrong. I mean, as Jim pointed out, and we were together during those historic days in August 1991. That putsch wasn't necessarily going to fail. I mean, they may have been wrong. In the weeks before I went out to Moscow in 1991, a senior figure in the U.S. government, who was briefing me, told me basically that Gorbachev had taken reforms as far as they could go, and we were now in for a protracted era of stagnation in the Soviet Union. Other people told me that they were expecting dramatic events within weeks, if not days, after my arrival in Moscow. U.S. government is a big place. And generally speaking, if you're making predictions rather than projections, you're a lucky individual if you get it right, and you're even luckier if somebody remembers. My real expertise was on East Germany. And 2.5 years before the wall came down, I made a firm prediction in the State Department that the GDR would cease to exist within 5 years, and everybody told me I was nuts. And if I'd been wrong, that would have been confirmed. But in retrospect, it made no impact on U.S. policy whatsoever.
I'm going to go to Steve to handle the other three questions. And since we've been so Russia-centric, if there are people in the room who view these events from the perspective of other countries in the region, we'll give you a chance to ask the final set of questions. Steve, you're next.
I'm not sure I remember the last three questions, but let me try. Is this mic on, by the way? It sounds like it's not. It is good. We all up here have to be elliptical because we're pressed for time. When I said that had the G7 committed money to Gorbachev in London in July, all I wanted to say was there would have been no coup in August. That's certain. They never would have touched him if he had come home with whatever he wanted. Because so many people think that the coup was the final precipitating factor in the end of the Soviet Union. When you think about the end of the Soviet Union, that's how you get to thinking about that what if. And beyond that, would they have stolen the money? Some of it, but not as much as was going to be stolen in the 1990s, because Gorbachev was running a different kind of operation. The perestroikachiki, the men who made perestroika, were not thieves. They may have been communists, but calling Gorbachev a communist, a typical communist, is like calling Luther a typical pope. I mean, the evidence is in. On the question of whether the Soviet Union could have existed without force and propaganda, it's a legitimate question. It's a serious question. It's much discussed. But there were other things that held the country together. There was a common education. There was the common socialization in the army. There were millions and millions of intermarriages between Russians and other people. There was the shared sense of victory in the war. There was a whole lot. You have to weigh everything in. Nobody can be certain what held it together essentially. But you have to take into account the argument you made that once the force and the propaganda was gone, the system was vulnerable. I want to just say one word because it grieves me greatly, and someone mentioned my writings of the 90s. I don't take seriously, and I hope Ambassador Collins will forgive me, the so-called American attempt at democracy building in Russia in the 1990s. Maybe because I grew up in Kentucky where we called a fast horse and a slow horse a slow horse. But once the United States supported Yeltsin's use of tanks against an elected parliament in October 1993, and then endorsed the Constitution that you all hate now because Putin lives by it, that he shoved through a falsified referendum in December 1993, the United States had no right to use the word democratization in regard to Russia because it was over at that moment. It was over. There was never again a free and fair election. It's just gotten worse in Russia. Why remember that today? Not to say that some of us were right and some of us were wrong, but to remember that when Washington bashes Putin as having invented whatever evil is unfolding in Russia today, Washington has completely forgotten the 1990s and the American support for the origins of Putinism in Yeltsinism. So let us understand what's going on. A friend of mine whom you would all admire because he's so pro-American said to me, quote, after Yeltsin, Putin was inevitable. In other words, he didn't mean Putin personally, but Putinism was inevitable. And I believe that's correct. I don't believe in inevitability, but it was a logical consequence. So let us keep things in perspective and remember that we did not play a positive role in 1990s, and we're paying the price today.
I'm tempted to pursue 93, but we don't have time. I think we have time for just one question, and we'll take it from a gentleman from Ukraine, so we have at least a slightly different perspective. Volodymyr Dubovik.
Thank you. I am Volodymyr Dubovik from Odessa, Ukraine, and here a Fulbright Fellow with the Cohen Institute. One impression that I got from today's discussion is that indeed it would make sense perhaps to throw an annual party here in Washington, D.C., where everyone who misses, for whatever reasons, the demise of the Soviet Union could come and talk to each other, and exchange their ideas about how they miss it. That wouldn't be probably a massive gathering, but substantial number of people would turn out. Second thing, very short, from a point of view of Ukrainian, who is from a Russian-speaking, Russia-dominated area of Ukraine, however, being a Ukrainian, consciously Ukrainian, I think it was a very important development for Ukraine to get this historic opportunity to move on with the nation state. I definitely believe that the whole argument that whatever might went wrong, and many things did go wrong in various post-Soviet republics, is some kind of argument in favor of concluding that the better solution was there for Soviet Union to still be intact. I don't buy this logic. It's just not fair to me. Finally, my question, I would still, quite unexpectedly, Blair, for you maybe, I would like to go back to Russia. Drawing to what you said in your presentations, your vast experience in dealing with Soviet Union and Russia, the lessons of what happened 15, 20 years ago back then in the former Soviet Union, how these lessons could be applied in U.S. dealing with present-day Russia? Do you think is there any value there, any lesson there, any kind of experience that you got back then that could be applied in Washington dealing with present-day Russia, which seems to be quite a challenge.
Okay, we only have about 3 minutes left, so I think we'll start with Dick, and anybody can say anything they want in response, or they don't have to speak if they don't want to.
Well, the only obvious thing would be that we did at that time stay in touch with as many different people as we could, with members of the Democratic Reform Movement, with opposition people, with dissidents, even when it was maybe pushing the envelope a little bit at that time to do it. I think the United States government has generally been out in front of other diplomatic establishments in doing that. And no matter the society, and I've done it in many different countries where I've been, including some pretty nasty ones, far more nasty than Putin's Russia. So I know that we are doing that in Russia today. We do have these consulates and the American corners around Russia, so that we do stay in touch. And I just think it's very, very important to have some contact between the American diplomats and all manner of people who live in that country. You never know what's going to happen. You really can't predict the future. You never know where future leaders are going to come from. And to the degree you can, it's very useful to try to influence those people. I mean, I represent this open world exchange program, largely with Russia, but with other countries too, including Ukraine. Well, we don't try to, coerce anyone into any particular form of thinking or way of thinking, but quite frankly, we do try to influence these young leaders in a positive manner and to develop positive feelings toward the United States as they visit us. That's why Congress appropriates the money for the program, and that's what we do.
Well, I would sort of add to that diplomacy is international relations about people. It's not about models, and we have a tendency too much of trying to put people into stereotypical boxes and understanding them within conceptual frameworks, which don't give them enough credit. I mean, for years, the United States didn't give Gorbachev enough credit. We didn't give Yeltsin enough credit. I suspect in some ways we don't actually even give Putin so much credit. But personal contacts are very important. I mean, who knows the benefits that may have come to the United States because Dick Miles was plying drink on Vladimir Putin when he was a junior official in the Leningrad city government. And the reason we don't do international relations by the internet, as Ross Perot once proposed, is because the human factor is extremely important. And I would say if there's any lesson from that period, is that you're not going to even begin to be able to predict the unforeseeable, let alone deal with it, if you don't really have your people out and about and actively in touch. And the biggest mistake that the Foreign Service, and I don't say this is for the Foreign Service, but the United States government has been making in recent years, has been pulling its people back into fortresses rather than what our people, the people I worked with, worked for, the people who worked under my supervision were doing in those days, which was getting out, taking even some personal risks, but getting out and doing the job the taxpayers are paying us to do.
I agree emphatically with those comments. I would just say I think one of the most useful lessons we should have taken from our diplomacy in ending the Cold War is that you talk to your adversaries. You don't look for excuses not to. And one of the big differences between the Reagan administration and our current administration is that many of the same forces that today say we shouldn't talk to this country or we can't talk to that country, etc., were the same ones that every small excuse they'd say, you see, you really can't deal with the Soviet Union. We're just somehow endorsing them if we talk to them. Reagan turned them down every time. He said, no, we've got to talk to them. We're on the same planet. We've got to deal with these problems. And he knows that you don't do that by saying you're going to force a regime change. I mean, who is going to deal with you if that is your goal? Well, it sort of boggles the mind. So, that's not a lesson necessarily for dealing with Russia. Actually, we've kept communication with Russia, but our general foreign policy, I think, has definitely suffered from failure to follow that principle that was a very strong one in my day.
Jim?
Yeah. in response to my Ukrainian colleague, I, for one, have absolutely no regret at the demise of the Soviet Union. In fact, I think it is probably one of the great transforming moments that is giving opportunities that were not there to a whole host of different peoples across a very big piece of the earth. That said, I think it's also true that we now face a long period in which it is going to take resources and people and some commitment on the part of not just the American government and the American people, but all of us, to two things with Russia. One is to ensure that we don't isolate that country or try to force it into itself. In my experience, Russia is least able to cope with the world when it feels it's isolated and under siege. And so keeping the world open to the Russian people and Russian involvement is going to be critical. And the other is simply to underscore what Dick and Wayne and others have said, that this is not just the business of government any longer. Russia is, with fits and starts, trying to join in a variety of ways the broadest understanding of the international community. And it's going to take time. I mean, I have said to a number of people recently that much of what's going on today reminds me of the debates in Britain before World War I, when a little country by the name of Germany was beginning to assert a role in the world economy and in the colonial effort to establish colonies, etc. It's very instructive to go back and read a bit about how Germany was described and how people thought about this. Well, Russia finds itself in much the same position, as do many of the other countries in that part of the world. They are new players on the world stage. The world is having just as big a time getting used to their presence as they are getting used to the idea that the world is now a part of their lives. And so it's going to take at least, I believe, a generation for that process to play out, and we need to have a certain amount of patience and empathy with the people trying to make it happen.
Steve, final short word.
I think Jack Matlock taught us one lesson. We did not win the Cold War, but when our ideology persuaded us we did. The next stop was Iraq, that kind of triumphalism. So we ought to understand what is going on when it happens. Finally, the man whose name this institute bears, George Kennan, wrote in 1950, when the communist system ends, we should keep our nose out of Russia's business. They will sort it out themselves. We did not follow that advice, and we should begin following it today.
Well, I will point out that we will soon be coming up on the 15th anniversary of 1993, so we'll have more to talk about as we move forward. Thank you all very much.
Brief idea I have, I'm going to be consulting a number of things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Audio, I thought it needs to be amplified. But I think we really need.
Are you in touch with the co-workers?
I'm going to talk to them.
It had been, yeah, for many years.
Asked this out before I came today.